Okay, folks, now we've got all of our spiral locks in on all of our piston rod assemblies. So I just want to share this. Before we put everything in, before we set the spiral locks, again, this is our even side, 2, 4, 6, 8. And then again, it's just how I do it, because so I can remind myself to check and double check, so you know you have everything oriented properly. But if you look, let me get our light here. So we know that the exhaust, number 2, exhaust small one, intake's big one, is how I have it marked. And then the chamfer on my rod is obviously going to be facing the throw. It's going to go against the throw on the crank. That's why I always have the counterweight. So as you can see, we have this oriented properly, we got this oriented properly. The reason why I say this is because, again, I'm going to reiterate, if you're used to building one type of engine, one brand of engine, you're going to make the assumption when you're building it, you're going to be in autopilot, and you're going to think they just all are uniform. Not all engines are like that. So this is where you check and you double check. At least it's how I do it. So now that we have all of our pre-pistons and our eagle rods all put together, assembled, we're about to check our bearing clearances for the rods. And then we're going to show you on it, when you buy a set of these rods, there's a number on these cap screws that gives you a torque value, tells you what to torque it to. So we're going to go over that. And then when we get ready to install our piston rings, this is another very, very, very important part. Don't make the assumption that the set of piston rings that you got are not filed to fit or filed to fit. You read the instructions. Here, these are filed to fit, and we're going to show just briefly how we're going to put our rings in, how we're going to measure. And if you look here, there is a method, there is a quick calculation for your bore size. And we're going to give you the bore in a moment and show you the bore size and the calculation and what we want to set our first and second ring gap to. Okay. Okay. Looks like we got about 3 thousandths. The very tightest. Okay. So we're good. We're right at 3 thousandths on our rod bearing clearances. So I'd say we're right where we want to be. I think some people shoot for 28, then some people like them looser, but I go per the formula, per what the diameter of the journal is, and that seems to be right where we want to be. So everything's looking good, folks, on our rod bearing clearances now, and our main bearing clearances are good. So now we're going to move forward with our piston ring installation. Talk about here is on the instructions. So if you look here, this tells you the bore times this calculation for both the top ring and the second ring. So if we plug in our bore, which is in 3.905, excuse me, 3.905 times 0.0045. They want 17.5 thou on both the top and the second ring gaps. We're about to square our rings up. We're going to build each piston. I do this one at a time. So we're going to do each piston one at a time. But I want to share with everybody, don't just go sticking your rings on and making assumptions. If this thing's too tight, you'll crack a land on your piston. Now our rod bearings clearances are set. We know that they're good. Now we're going to move on to the piston rings. So with our instructions, with the total seal rings, I'm trying to find the box to show you what the gaps were, but I can't hear in a moment. But this is the important part right here. Here it is. So our rings are the total seal high performance. This is the part number CR100530, so a 30 over Pontiac 350. And looks like the top and second rings are 1/16, and the bottom royal rings is a 3/16. So what I really want to talk about here is on the instructions. So if you look here, This tells you the bore times this calculation for both the top ring and the second ring. So if we plug in our bore, which is in 3.905, excuse me, 3.905 times 0.0045. They want 17.5 thou on both the top and the second ring gaps. We're about to square our rings up. We're going to build each piston. I do this one at a time. So we're going to do each piston one at a time. But I want to share with everybody, don't just go sticking your rings on and making assumptions. If this thing's too tight, you'll crack a land on your piston, or you'll go overboard or something. So again, this is what really makes and breaks sometimes. I'm not saying that, you know, there's this huge horsepower gain, but it's just makes for a nice tight engine when you stay in all the manufacturer's suggested installation parameters. I'm installing my piston ring. This is the top ring, and this is for the number 1 piston. Squeeze it, get it in here. Okay, now I use probably need to take these gloves off. Yep. I use a ring squaring tool. It's very cheap, but you can also use a piston. You just want to make sure that ring is in there square. That's not this way or this way. So I'm just going to push down. Okay, so I know that everything is squared up. Turn it. Yep, we're nice and square. So now I'm going to take my feeler gauges, and I don't know if you can see the gap right here, but I can just tell by looking at it, it's already most likely too tight. So we're going to get our feeler gauges, and we're going to see where we're at. Okay, so now I can even tell by looking, and I don't have that great of vision, but you see how tight that ring gap is? I can barely get 4 thou in to that end gap. So obviously that is a tight 4. It's probably 3. So obviously we know these have to be cut. So what we're going to do, we're going to start with this first top ring, and we're going to bring it over here to the ring grinder. Now you can use a manual one. They work great. They're wonderful. I got to where I was doing more and more engines. I just went ahead and bought one from Proform. But this is where we set our rings up, and we're going to cut the gap just a little bit at a time. Just a little bit at a time. Okay, so okay, I just want to show people how you set one of these rings up. This is how I set it up. It's very important that you get, if you see here where the ring is engaging my grinding wheel, I want to make sure that that is squared up, that it's not hitting it at an angle in some way. So I get them as square as I can, and you can adjust this thing, and I'm not going to get into the boring details, but again, when I go to use this machine, you see I've zeroed out my dial indicator here. It's at 0 or pretty close. Now I know I had most likely 3, and I've got about 14 to go, 14 and a half. So I'll probably shoot for, you know, an 18, that may be 17, 18. It's not going to break the bank and make a difference if I'm off a thou or 2 here. But you see what we're trying to accomplish. So I'm about to start grinding, and I'm just going to go a little at a time. Okay, you see where it's real shiny, where I've started grinding on it right there? Sorry, my hands are shaking. I started grinding on it. Now, you know that when I did that, there's a burr on that. I can even drag it with my fingernail. So you always want to take a little small file like this, and it's not going to hurt anything. You just sit there and you just kind of file that little edge off. That's what I do. I just file the little edge off there on both sides. Do it with my hands. I see that side's gone. I'll do the same thing on this side. Doesn't take much. Don't have to hog on it or anything. You just want the burr gone. There it is. Now we're going to try to see where we're at on our end gap. Okay, and I knew that I was going to be a little off, but that's okay. I always sneak up on it. Now I'm at 12 thou, but that's good. I know I'm making headway. I'm just going to go a little bit more. The thing is, You want to take your time in this. You're not in a race. This is where you take your time. This is one of the biggest things between setting main bearings and rod bearing clearances. This is what you do to make sure that everything is where it needs to be. I don't want to have that feeling that, oh, did I get the end gap right? And once this thing gets up, is it going to break a piston land? Now, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to go through and cut the rest of these rings. I'm going to get this one closer to the 17. We're going to do the same thing with the second ring, and then we're going to put our oil rings on, and then we're going to install. And eventually we're going to make sure we have enough clearance, because this is a stroker. So we're going to do one rod at a time and make sure we've got clearance between the block and the rods. Okay, now I've cut on this a couple times, but now I have a nice 17, a tight 18. So I would say I'm pretty darn close as to where we need to be. So again, this is, it takes just a little bit of time. Yeah, this is a tight 18. So we're right exactly where we need to be. We're going to continue on. I'm not going to video each and every piston, but this is just one of the pieces I want to show everybody, especially when you do a stroker engine and you've got high performance parts. Read the directions on your bearings, your fasteners, your rings. So let me tell you what happens since how the piston's on here real quick. If this piston ring end gap is too tight, what's going to happen is your lands, these are called your lands. Most people know this. This is just for people that never really built an engine before. Once that ring gets hot, it has nowhere to go. That gap, it's going to be, once it butts up, it's going to buckle. When I say buckle, it's going to start doing like a washboard effect. It's going to break those lands. That's what's going to happen. And then you got a really smoky engine and it's not very happy. Okay, now I've got right at 17 and a half, maybe a tight 18 on both the top and second ring on our number one piston. I want to get in and I want to show everybody though, again, attention to the details. So sometimes not, most times so, at least on the top ring, you're going to have a dot. Dots go up every time. The second ring on this set also has a dot. Goes up. They always go up. But look at your instructions to make sure. I want to tell you how I know and what it'll do in just a moment. But I'm going to go ahead and install. This is our second ring. We've already installed the oil ring. I think most people already know how this goes. It's very simple. You install the expander first and then the rails. I put my rail on the outside, on each side, second and third. Pretty easy. So I'm about to install my second ring, and these are piston ring pliers specifically to install piston rings. So there she goes. She's in the second ring. Very nice. Now I'm about to install my first ring. And again, you always start, you put your, at least how I do it anyway, I put my oil rings on first, then go to the second, and obviously end up at the first. And then I will orient the end gaps where they're all 180 from each other, or excuse me, I believe 60, whatever it is, but none of them will be aligned. So let me tell you my experience with putting in piston rings upside down or the dots down. So one of my first really, I would say high-end, not a high-end build, but it was an engine built for my 68 Barracuda, a small block Mopar Stroker. Just like this, as far as, you know, with the rods and the pistons, and it had rings similar to this. Well, me being, this was 20-something years ago, me being so eager to get this thing together, I had a great machine shop in North Texas. It's called Wells Racing. And Dennis Wells is a great guy. Gentleman has, just like our machinist up here, 50 years of building high-end dirt track engines, drag engines, and everything. So I get my engine built and I get it running. It runs fantastic. Fantastic. I'm really excited. So we go put it on the drag strip. I make a pass down the quarter mile in Ennis, Texas with this engine. Ran great, but I look at my back and it looks like a mosquito truck behind me. I get into the pits and I open the hood and it looks like an oil bath all over this engine. Basically major blow-by.
and I couldn't figure out what I did wrong. Did I not use the right break-in oil? No, I used right break-in oil. What did I miss? Did I miss the end gaps? So obviously I couldn't run it anymore like that. So I took the engine apart, and I took my block up to wells, and I took my pistons. And the great guy Dennis he looked at my pistons, and first thing he did is he moved one of these rings up, looked on the back sides. Yep, you got your piston rings upside down. I said, are you kidding me? He said, yeah, dots always go up, son, they always go up. I said, oh. But you know what he said? He said, do you really think you're the first person that ever did that? I said, no. He said, don't sweat it, just turn the rings upside back, dots up, go for it. So Dennis made me feel so damn good, and he could have made me feel like an idiot, but he didn't. But that was a great learning lesson on piston rings and installing them correctly that I always remember when I build these things. I think of him. So dots up, everybody. Now we're about to get ready to install our #1 rod and piston assembly, and then we're gonna torque it, we're gonna rotate it, and then we're gonna check, make sure we've got clearance. Okay, I've oiled my cylinder down as well as the piston. Now this is where it gets into the tapered ring compressor and why I love them. We're gonna just go in right here. And another thing is, I like to use a guide. Sometimes I'll put the guide in once I've got the piston engaged, but it's far enough away from the journal. And I'm gonna tell you here why just here in a second. But we're gonna go ahead and put our piston into our tapered ring compressor here, specifically for this bore. Now, I'm just gonna start squeezing the rings a little bit, and eventually it's gonna go in. We have to get a little screwdriver. There it goes. There it goes. I just do it kind of by hand. Now you see, I've already got it. Now it's starting to compress, and I've made sure that I've triple checked, made sure that my orientation's correct with the radius on the rod. All that's good. Now here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go ahead and put it in here like so. Get the skirts engaged into the bore. And look how easy this is. Sometimes I don't even need this. It just depends. Now, you don't have to have the guide on that I have on right now. But let me tell you, do not get over, if you're not careful, you go slam it down on a piston, it may go in there real fast and you'll ding that journal. Especially if you have stock rods where the bolt is going through. This has the caps that are the other way, but I like to guide it, and I want to make sure that that journal is protected as I go down. So I'm just holding on to the journal, and I'm just going to gently see how I'm going slow? My guide's lined up. And there we are. So now I'm still a long way from the journal, but I know I'm guiding the rod with my rod guide. And what I do is I press that plastic guide against the journal. I know it's clean. See, now hear it? There it is. Okay, now we're going to turn it over and we're going to put our cap on. Okay, I want to show everybody something. So this is very important. When you get your aftermarket rods, it's going to come with a set of instructions, just like the rings do. So our rods that came from Eagle has the torque values. And here it is right here. We'll come over here where we can see it. So you look at the number. Our rod bolts have an 8740, but there's two of them that have 8740. There's a 3/8 and there's a 7/16. We have the 7/16 bolt head. So our torque value, we're not using a stretch gauge, but we are using a torque wrench. And it says to torque to 63 foot-pounds. Here's the other thing. When you go to thread these, it's very important to use
the ARP thread lubrication, the final assembly stuff, it's right here, okay? They don't put this in there for trinkets. You put this just enough on the threads and under the bolt head. So just kind of a thing to remember. Again, pay attention to what you have. Okay, now, here's the other part. We're doing this one piston and rod assembly at a time because this is a stroker. This is the other part you got to pay attention to. You may have to clearance the block depending on how much stroke and your block architecture. So we're going to spin the crank with the rod. There's two places I'm going to look for. One is the rod cap, the rod main cap bolt, and the bottom of the skirt on the other side, but I'll show that in just a moment. If you look right here, I only have to use a feeler gauge. I've got tons of clearance, so we're good there. The other place I'm going to look for is the rod at the bottom of the skirt here and the rod bolt. And I've got tons of clearance. I'm going to show you how much. Yeah, we're way past it now. Very good. So I have over, let's see, that is 60, 90. I've got about 130 thousandths. Well, I can add those up, but I know that's plenty of clearance between that rod and the bottom of that skirt. Again, two places that you got to measure. Now, some engines are very, very gracious in the crankcase area. It looks like Pontiacs are too. Small block Chevys, most of the time when you stroke them, you're gonna have to clearance the bottom of the skirt many times. Maybe not. It just depends on the rod you got, I guess. And then usually it's about right here at the bottom of the skirt. So you just want to look at those two places. Small and big block Chrysler, if you go to the 4-inch stroke, you don't have to clearance anything. Big block Chrysler up to a 4 1/4 stroke, you don't have to clearance anything. Looks like this Pontiac right here is giving us plenty of clearance, but we're going to check each and every board, every rod and piston assembly, especially after we have the oil pump and all that stuff on. I just want to make sure so you don't want any unpleasant surprises. So we're moving right along.